Thank you for coming out on this blustery day. It's some wind that's going on out there right now. Speaking of wind, we're going to start our program with our signature piece for this concert season. This is the Fanfare for a New Era by Pinkzebra. composer, Vaughn Williams, when World War I broke out, was 42 years old, and he was too old for military service. So he joined the Royal Ambulance Corps and saw activity in France, where he served as a stretcher bearer during some of the early battles that took place. By 1970, there had been so many casualties in British service that the age restrictions had been dropped. And Vaughn Williams was able to get a commission as a lieutenant in the Royal Corps of Artillery, where he had responsibility for horses. You may be wondering why. From World War I, horses were still very important for moving around heavy pieces of artillery. The war ended. Vaughn Williams was in occupation army in Germany. And somebody pointed out to the general staff that perhaps the greatest living British composer was serving in the artillery as an artillery officer. Well, Vaughn Williams was then given responsibility for organizing musical activities for the British soldiers who were in Germany and in France, while they were awaiting such time for demobilization. In other words, when they were going to be returned back to the United Kingdom and become civilians again. Vaughn Williams' service was remembered in 1923 when the Royal School of Military Music asked him to write a piece for band. Back at that time, every regiment in the British Army had a band. And for much of the history, early history of the band played music that was primarily written for orchestra and then rewritten for band. With the exception of marches and a few other pieces. So Vaughn Williams contributed one of the first original pieces of band music. It's called the Folk Song Suite. It's in 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. And in here, incorporated parts of 8 separate folk songs that were popular or known in the British Isles in the 19th and early 20th century. We'd like to share this wonderful classic for band with you right now. Folk Song Suite by Vaughn Williams. The 3 movements. You can hold your applause until the end if you wish. cover the solo part there, piccolo solo by Alfred. Clarinet solo by Straus. Two trumpet solos, one by Alfred. The other solo by Larry Rock. We're now going to the world of opera, but without many singing. Jules Massenet was probably the most important composer of French operas in the second half of the 19th century. He wrote well over 40 operas, and some 5 or 6 are still performed today. One of those is called Thais. And there is a section in Thais where it's necessary to go over a period of time and location. So, Massenet, rather than having the curtain closed, composed an intermezzo to go ahead and take that spot. In the opera, it is performed as a violin solo with orchestral accompaniment. However, we're going to perform it for you today as a flute solo with band accompaniment. And instead of having just one flute, we're going to use all of the members of the Waldwick Band flute section. This is the meditation from Opera Thais by Jules Massenet. Our next composition was composed by a member of the Sousa band during the latter years of the Sousa band, DeLuca. He was a cornet soloist, and I'm not certain if he actually wrote this piece when he was in the Sousa band or afterwards. Title was interesting. It's the White and Red Rose March. You know that in the United States there is a tea that is called Red Rose. In Canada there is a tea that is called White Rose. But I doubt he was writing about teas. Instead he was probably writing, maybe inspired by the so-called War of the Roses that occurred in England during a period of time when it was battling out between the House of York and the House of Lancaster as who was going to provide the next king of England, because both of these royal houses had a claim to the throne. But it doesn't sound at all like music for war. Instead it sounds like a jolly march, perfect for a day like today. had a fanfare by somebody who was going under the name of Pinkzebra. And we had music from the United Kingdom, it was called Phillip. We had music from the opera, music from a member of the Sousa band. And our next composition is from Hollywood, from the movies. It Had Better Be Tonight was composed by Henry Mancini for the first Pink Panther movie. And this takes place in a ski lodge, a party in a ski lodge, where actually a singer by the name of Fred Jeffries performs this song for all of the guests that are there. And of course, it was a wonderful cast for the film. You had Peter Sellers, Capuchin, Wagner, Robert Wagner, and many others, David Niven. And how can you go wrong with a movie with actors like that? And how can you go wrong with a movie score that was composed by Henry Mancini? And right now, we're going to perform with you It Had Better Be Tonight from the Pink Panther. Let's have a more global Waldwick's own FAQ. We're continuing on our program now with a original work of band by a composer named Alfred Reed. And after the service of World War II, Alfred Reed was a studio musician in New York City for radio. For many years, probably from the late 1920s until the 1960s, a radio station often employed musicians to go and play for the shows. And for these musicians needed music. Alfred Reed composed a lot of music that would have been used on radio shows like on CBS, WOR, NBC, and the other major networks. Eventually, he became a music professor at University of Miami. And his primary responsibility was teaching music industry. In other words, how people could go ahead and work and get employment in the world of music on the commercial aspect. Well, we're going to do an overture by him. And right now, I'd like everybody to say, bum, 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 bum. Here we go, I'm going to try that. Bum, 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 bum. And that is a theme that's going to be reappearing over and over in this overture. So you already know something to listen for. Great. So here we have a festive overture by Alfred. Now continuing on, we're going to have a Sousa march for you. And this is one of the most famous of the Sousa marches. It came about when Sousa was still the director of the Green Band. Now, Sousa started his life as a professional musician when he was approximately 13 years of age. A theater company had come to town, and Sousa was a young violin player of some pretty good talent. And Sousa decided that he was going to go off with that theater company and play in their orchestra. Well, Sousa's father, who was a musician in the Marine Band, found out about this and took Sousa down to the Marine Corps office and enlisted him. He was enlisted as a boy musician and played with the band. Even though the violin was the primary instrument, he learned several other instruments. Eventually, he left the Marine Band to become a theatrical music composer and director of shows. And in 1880, the position of leader of the Marine Band opened up. And apparently, young Sousa's reputation was such that he was invited to come and to lead the Marine Band, which he did from 1880 until 1892, when he was enticed to go for the famous Sousa Professional Band. In 1891, the Washington Post, which was at that time one of a number of newspapers in Washington, D.C., and not the most important newspaper, had a contest for school-aged children to write an essay. And at the ceremony, where the winners were announced and the prizes were given out, Sousa had been asked to write some music for the ceremony. So he composed this march. And the week after the ceremony, the Washington Post newspaper actually printed the music in the newspaper. So that if you played piano, you could take pages right out of the newspaper and play the Washington Post march. And this really went ahead and made this well known. It became so well known that it was not only used as music for marching, but also became known as dance music. And they danced to the Washington Post. Well, we're not going to dance to you, but we are going to play Washington Post March by Jonathan Sousa. competition is from both a Broadway show and from a musical. Now the group ABBA was a Swedish pop group that was popular from 1972 to 1982. And they wrote a number of songs. In 2001, a team took some of the songs written by the group and used them to create a musical called Mamma Mia, which ran very successfully on Broadway. It ran for actually 13 years on Broadway continuously. And at one time it was the 9th longest running show on Broadway. Well, whenever you got a show like that, you have to make a movie. Make some more money, right? Okay, so in 2008, the movie version of the musical came out. It was a really big hit. It grossed over $400 million. And there was a follow-up that came out a few years ago, a sequel. They used some of the same music in different songs by ABBA in it. Well, we would like to play some of the highlights of the show, if you like it. Starting on August the 2nd, there's going to be a revival of Mamma Mia on Broadway. It's going to be a limited run, 6 months. 6-month run. If it's successful. If it's not successful, they close after a week. But it will probably be successful. And in any case, this is either a review of the movie you saw, or the show that you saw, or it's going to be a little taste of the future, if you're going to go to New York to see it. Highlights from Mamma Mia. I once went to a program where the composer, Philip, was there. And he was saying, he was talking, of course, about classical music. And he said that many pieces of music, perhaps the majority of pieces of music, are only played once or a few times. And then they disappear out of the repertoire. And it's only a small portion of all the music that's ever been composed that we get to know. You know, or Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, there were probably another 100 symphonies that are written by composers that we never heard of, that received performances that may have been well liked when they were originally presented. This is true of the popular music. A lot of songs that you might hear on cable or radio or television are popular now. But the question is anybody going to be listening to them next year or 5 years or 10 years from now? One thing interesting thing about a lot of music of the so-called swing era, even though some of these songs are 70 to 85 years old, are still popular today. And we're going to be playing a piece called the Big Band Spectacular that is including pieces from famous big bands that are still popular today. And we're going to start off with In the Mood, of course, which was from the North Band. And then later, Satin Dollar from Duke Ellington Orchestra. Then Cherry Berry Bin from the Harry James Orchestra. And we're going to end up with Jumping at the Woodside from the Count Basie Orchestra. So here we go with our big band spectacular. and Cherry Berry Bins, the soul was taken by Matt Oliveri. And that will be going to the Berklee College of Music in the fall. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. This is our last indoor concert of this year. Our next indoor concert will be next November, and we'll be presenting our winter series at that time. This summer, the next activity of Waldwick Band is on the 24th of May. We will be in Bismarck Park for their Memorial Day Parade and Observation. And then on the 26th, we will be in both the Waldwick and the Whitehall parades. Then, the 4th of July, we'll be in the parades in Glenbrook and Ridgewood, and we'll be doing the Allendale fireworks. In August, we'll be in Richfield Park, and late August, very end of August, but Labor Day comes early this year, we will be in Folsom. We may be doing a couple additional concerts that we are still in negotiations with. So check our website out if you have access to a computer, waldwickband.org. That's where you'll find us. We'd like to express our appreciation to the Village School for the use of this wonderful facility. We'd also like to express our appreciation to the cupola in Ridgewood, where we rehearse. And of course, we are always very appreciative that you are here today as part of our audience, braving those blustering winds that were out there. Our last competition is going to be Sousa's Liberty Bell March. A trivia question: what television show used the Liberty Bell as a theme music? Absolutely right. Monty Python. And if you look at your record, today's record, you'll find that there is an article, because 50 years ago, this week, the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail came out. And that was part of the basis of what eventually became known as Spamalot on Broadway. Okay, so here we go. Going back to the original Monty Python and going back to American patriotic music with the Liberty Bell March of John Phillippe.
Liberty Bell 2025.
There we go. Played by Edith